They say the longer you stay in a place, the more invisible you become. I never used to believe that. When I first started at Caldas and Moreau, I was 24, nervous, and dressed like someone trying very hard not to look poor. I didn't have a college degree, didn't know the first thing about quarterly reports or performance metrics, but I could type fast, I could listen better than most, and I had something else, something no one else in that building had. I knew how to speak with my hands. American Sign Language wasn't something I picked up in night school or learned for a resume boost. It was something I lived. My best friend Angela lost her hearing in 8th grade after a sudden illness. No one knew how to talk to her after that. People either ignored her or shouted like that would help. But I couldn't leave her behind, so I learned. At first, it was messy, fingers tripping, eyebrows doing all the wrong things. But eventually, it became second nature. And I didn't stop. Even after high school, even after life tugged us in different directions, I kept practicing. When I landed a job at Caldas and Moreau, ASL had nothing to do with it. I started as a temp, answering phones, running coffee, printing spreadsheets. But slowly, as years passed and faces changed, I made myself indispensable in quiet ways. I remembered birthdays, I fixed jammed copiers. I helped the COO's daughter with her college essays on my lunch breaks. Nothing glamorous, nothing anyone applauded. But people started to rely on me. Then, about 5 years ago, something unexpected happened. Our company had been trying to land a partnership with Delacroix Systems, a French-American tech conglomerate with deep pockets and deeper expectations. They had a global footprint and a reputation for cutting off deals the moment someone flubbed a single detail. Our CEO at the time, Mr. Randall, was desperate. The deal would open doors to European markets, triple our distribution channels, and bring in contracts big enough to float entire departments. Everyone knew it. There was just one catch. Their CEO, Thomas Delacroix, is profoundly deaf. Our executive team scrambled to bring in interpreters, consultants, communication advisors. None of it worked. The meetings were tense, full of stilted exchanges and half-meant smiles. I remember sitting in the back corner of the conference room, taking notes, watching Thomas's expression harden every time someone fumbled a sign or paused for an interpreter to catch up. No one could match his pace. No one understood his language, not really. And then, one day, I did something reckless. The lead interpreter froze mid-sentence, unsure how to translate a clause about intellectual property. Thomas raised an eyebrow, his fingers tapping against the polished table in irritation. Without thinking, I stepped forward. I signed the clause myself, carefully, precisely. His head turned. He looked at me, not past me, not through me, but at me. And for the first time in that entire meeting, he smiled. Not the polite kind, but a real one. Warm, surprised. From that day on, I became the unofficial liaison for all things Delacroix. I didn't get a raise, I didn't get a new title, but I got something else: trust. Every time Thomas visited, he asked for me. Every deal we closed, every adjustment, every renegotiation. He wanted me in the room. Not because I was the best negotiator, not because I had a degree in linguistics, but because he knew I could hear him, even when he wasn't speaking. The irony? Most people at Caldas didn't even realize how important that was. To them, I was just Susan who does the hand thing. I was the quiet woman who'd been around forever, who didn't ask for much, who always said yes. I didn't mind, not really. I never needed my name on the wall. I just wanted to be useful, needed, valued, even in a quiet way. There's a type of man who believes a diploma makes him bulletproof. Marcus Bell was that man. He walked into our lives like a PowerPoint presentation, sleek, color-coded, and utterly devoid of soul. He was announced with fanfare in an all-staff email that used the word visionary 3 times and results-driven twice. I knew immediately he wasn't here to learn. He was here to conquer. He started on a Thursday. By Monday, the entire energy of the office had changed. The warmth that used to hum quietly through the halls, the sound of familiar voices, The occasional chuckle from the break room had been replaced by silence. Uneasy, tight-lipped silence. People smiled less, laughed only in whispers. I kept my head down, not because I was afraid, but because I'd seen this movie before. And I already knew how it ended. Marcus didn't introduce himself to the team. He didn't walk the floors or ask for anyone's story. He didn't even shake my hand the first time we passed in the hallway. Just gave me a brisk nod, like I was a janitor he wasn't quite sure he needed to acknowledge. I watched him from a distance for the first few days. His shiny shoes, his buzzwords, his insistence on performance reviews and KPI dashboards for departments that functioned perfectly fine without them. He wore his Harvard education like armor, quoted business books like scripture. Everything was about leaning out legacy roles and streamlining inefficiencies. He spoke in absolutes, in numbers, in cold strategic directives. He didn't understand people. Worse, he didn't care to. One morning, I saw him in the conference room with the heads of 3 departments. I was walking past when I heard him say it, clear as crystal. Seniority doesn't equal value. Experience is only relevant if it produces measurable outcomes. No one challenged him, not even Greg from legal, who'd been with the company longer than I had. That was the moment I knew. He wasn't going to see me. To Marcus Bell, I was a line item, a cost, a relic. I didn't have a degree. I didn't have data-verified output. All I had was 19 years of trust, intuition, and a silent language only I spoke. And none of that fit into his spreadsheet. 2 days later, the meeting invite came. Performance alignment review. No explanation, no agenda. Just a time, a room, and a cold feeling in my gut that never quite went away. I walked in wearing my navy sweater and flats, the outfit I wore the first day I interpreted for Thomas Delacroix. I stood straighter in it, firmer. It reminded me who I was, even if they'd forgotten. Marcus was seated behind a sleek glass desk, his laptop open but not facing me. He didn't rise when I entered, just waved a hand at the chair across from him like I was there for a dentist appointment. "Susan," he said, scanning a digital file, "thank you for coming." He looked up, expression blank. "You've been with us quite some time." 19 years, I said. He blinked once. "Right, that long." Then, without ceremony, he got to the point. "We're auditing all roles for relevance, efficiency, and alignment with future growth. And frankly, your position is difficult to justify. No formal education, no technical certification. You don't meet our current benchmarks for what we define as a qualified employee." I didn't speak. He kept going. "I understand you've contributed in various ways, but unfortunately, we're moving in a different direction. Your role will be dissolved, effective immediately." That was it. 19 years boiled down to a paragraph. No thank you, no farewell, no mention of Thomas, no understanding of what I actually did. He leaned back, clearly expecting either a breakdown or a plea. I gave him neither. Instead, I stood slowly, meeting his eyes. "I hope," I said carefully, "that when Thomas Delacroix arrives Monday, you'll find the right words to greet him." Marcus looked puzzled. "What?" I smiled, cold, clean, calm. "Good luck with your next negotiations." And I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry. I didn't even pack my things that day. I just left, took the elevator down 17 floors, and stepped outside into the late afternoon air. The city humming around me like it hadn't just watched my world shrink. Back home, I sat by the window in silence. No buzz of incoming emails. No alerts reminding me about conference calls or partner check-ins. Just stillness. I stared at the skyline and thought about all the times I had sat in that boardroom across from Thomas Delacroix, watching his fingers speak faster than most people could think, watching his sharp eyes pick up on pauses, shifts, signals no one else even noticed. And I thought about Marcus Bell, who thought communication was just a checkbox on a chart. He had no idea what was coming, because while I had walked out quietly, Monday would arrive. and so would Thomas. And the room would be waiting, empty, silent, untranslated. I didn't shout. I didn't storm out or throw a final file folder across Marcus Bell's polished desk. There was no grand exit, no declaration of betrayal or injustice. Just the soft tap of my shoes against the tile floor as I walked out of the building I had given my life to. I held my things in a small box: my Queen of Syntax mug, a couple of signed notebooks, a framed photo of Angela and me, laughing at a beach 20 years ago. The building's glass doors slid shut behind me with a mechanical whoosh, so impersonal it felt almost symbolic. Outside, the city was just as loud, alive, and indifferent as always. But inside me, something had changed. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was a deeper silence, a pause before an answer, the kind of stillness you feel right before a storm you didn't summon. I went home, took the long route. No train, no bus, just walking, letting the rhythm of my footsteps and the noise of the streets distract me from the weight pressing against my chest. Back in my apartment, I didn't sit. I didn't cry. I didn't pour myself a drink or sink onto the couch. I just set the box down on the kitchen counter and opened my notebook, one of the old ones with frayed corners and ink smudges from years of meetings, notes, and sketches of hand signs I used to refine my own shorthand. Then I picked up the phone. Call 1. Professor Lanning. She was the first person who ever took me seriously. I hadn't spoken to her in over a year, since her last lecture at the community center. But she answered on the second ring. Hello? I didn't say anything. Instead, I closed my eyes and signed the first phrase I'd ever signed to her, back when I was 17 and nervous and unsure. How do I say thank you? She was silent on the line. Then I heard her take a breath. Oh, Susan, she said softly. Who do I need to talk to? I laughed, the kind of tired, quiet laugh that comes out like a sigh. It's done, I said. Not for them, it isn't, she replied. Do they know what they've lost? No, I said, but they're about to find out. She didn't ask what I needed. She just said, you tell me when. And then I hung up. Call 2. Ian Keller. Ian had always been more fire than finesse, but he was loyal in the way few people were anymore. He used to be in business development at Caldus, sharp, occasionally cocky, but brilliant at reading a room. When he left for London, we stayed in touch in the sporadic way real friends do, quiet stretches followed by deep dives. He picked up with a groggy, Susan, it's 2 a.m. here. I paused. Then I said just 2 words. It happened. He didn't ask what I meant. Oh no, they didn't. They did, I said. Jesus, he muttered. Marcus Bell? I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. What did you say? Nothing dramatic, just wished him good luck with his next negotiations. There was a beat of silence. Then Ian let out a low, grim chuckle. He's not going to make it through Monday. That's the plan, I said quietly. He exhaled. You need anything, tech, slides, legal language. I've got you. I might, I said. Soon. Call 3. Celeste Langlois. This one took the most breath to make. Celeste was as composed as she was terrifying when needed. She'd worked with Thomas Delacroix for over a decade, and we'd become partners in our own quiet way. She handled logistics. I handled presence. We didn't gossip. We didn't small talk. But we trusted each other with the kind of precision that only comes from surviving dozens of cross-continental negotiations together. When she picked up, her tone was crisp. Susan? I said nothing at first. Then I signed, slow and steady. I am no longer with the company. Her breath caught. I heard it. What? Effective immediately, I said. A pause. Did Marcus fire you? I didn't answer. I see, she said, cold now, measured. Has Thomas been informed? Not yet. He will be. There was no anger in her voice, just steel. The kind of tone you use when preparing to execute an operation. I said, he'll ask for me Monday. He always does, she said. Then she added, "They've made a mistake." I nodded. A very loud one. When I hung up, my apartment was still quiet. But now the silence had shape. Purpose. I spent the next 2 hours organizing. Not papers, memories, notes, patterns, signals. I pulled up every old email I'd saved, every gesture Thomas had ever used that required explanation. Every time I'd smoothed over a miscommunication or rephrased a clumsy sentence from our side in a way that saved the deal. I made a list of them all, and beside each one I wrote, "Can a machine do this?" I already knew the answer, but Marcus Bell didn't. He thought firing me was a cost-saving maneuver, that replacing a human connection with software would keep the partnership humming. He hadn't yet realized that Delacroix didn't do business with systems. He did business with people, and I had been his person for 5 years. Now I was waiting. Monday was coming, and so was the silence. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. I, the one always 5 minutes early, was now watching the clock from the other side of the city. I didn't set an alarm. I didn't need one. My body woke me up before the sun, as it always did on important days. It had been trained, over years of silent preparation, to rise before the rest of the world so I could greet it in stillness. Today, that instinct still held, but this time, there was no briefing, no carefully pressed blouse, no breakfast eaten with one hand while editing a document with the other. Just tea, silence, and anticipation. Today was the Delacroix meeting, and I wasn't going. Instead, I sat cross-legged on the floor beside my window, watching the city unfold, inch by inch, unaware that a slow disaster was gathering momentum. Across town, on the 23rd floor of Caldas and Moreau, panic was beginning to simmer, though no one had said it out loud yet. Marcus Bell arrived at the office at 8:54 a.m., late by CEO standards, sipping an Americano and reviewing the morning's agenda through half-lidded eyes. He had been briefed the week before that the Delacroix negotiation was a routine check-in, with a file so sanitized of history it barely registered as urgent. What the file didn't say, what he never thought to ask, was that Delacroix Systems had never, not once, agreed to a meeting without me in the room. Because they didn't deal with systems, they dealt with people, and I was that person. At 9:26 a.m., Celeste Langlois entered the building with her usual grace. Minimal makeup, impeccable posture, and an expression that could freeze a fire. She said little to the receptionist. Her presence alone was enough to part the waters of uncertainty. She was followed by 2 associates in sharp gray suits, and finally, Thomas Delacroix himself. He was taller than most remembered, with silver at his temples and eyes that missed nothing. He carried no briefcase, no tablet, just himself, and his silence, and the power that came with both. The executive assistant who greeted them smiled too brightly. "Mr. Delacroix, Ms. Langlois, welcome, right this way." Thomas nodded, but said nothing. Celeste's hands fluttered briefly, translating. Inside the glass conference room, everything had been prepared. Bottled water lined up in perfect symmetry, a massive display screen blinking with a logo animation, a stack of contract drafts fanned neatly at each seat. What hadn't been prepared? The human connection. There was no interpreter, no gesture toward inclusion. No one even realized it. At 9:58, the room began to fill with Caldas executives, legal, finance, strategy, young, confident, and wholly unaware of the current ticking beneath the surface. They greeted one another with nods and murmured jokes, oblivious to the tension already blooming in the corners of the room. At 10:01, Marcus Bell walked in. Marcus Bell walked. He smiled broadly, arms spread like a host at a dinner party. "Mr. Delacroix, Ms. Langlois, thank you for coming. We're thrilled to have you here today." Celeste signed his words, but Thomas remained still. Marcus chuckled lightly, as if giving Thomas time to warm up. He didn't. Instead, Thomas looked slowly, deliberately, around the room, and signed one word. "Susan?" Celeste did not respond immediately. She hesitated, then signed something short, something final. Thomas's expression didn't change, but the air in the room did. It was like someone had opened a window and let in a storm. Celeste spoke softly. "Mr. Delacroix would like to know where Miss Rivers is." Marcus blinked. "Susan." He turned slightly, confused. "Who's—" Before anyone could answer, Thomas raised his hands again, signing more rapidly now. His brows furrowed, his fingers sharp and precise. Celeste watched carefully, then translated. "Mr. Delacroix says he will not proceed until Ms. Rivers is present. She is the only one authorized, as per his internal team protocol, to interpret and clarify terms." A ripple moved through the room. Marcus's face flushed. "I wasn't made aware of that. I was told the language barrier could be handled via translation tools." Celeste's expression didn't shift, but her voice cooled. "Mr. Delacroix does not do business through tools. He conducts relationships. He signed every previous agreement through direct conversation, facilitated by someone who understands both language and context. That person is Susan Rivers." Marcus scrambled. Can someone get her on the line? Do we have her contact in HR? What about contracting her short term?" Too late. Thomas stood. No dramatic gesture, no slammed fist, just the smooth, practiced movement of a man who knew his time was being wasted. He signed quickly to Celeste. She nodded. Then to Marcus in the room. "This meeting is concluded. Delacroix Systems will reassess our relationship with Caldas and Moreau after reviewing the personnel changes and communication deficiencies." The word deficiencies stung louder than a shouted insult, and then they walked out. No one moved. The silence left in their wake was deafening. No one looked at Marcus. No one breathed. Because everyone had just realized that a silent woman with no degree and an old mug on her desk had been holding up a multi-million-dollar partnership for 5 years, and they had cut her loose without even understanding what she did. Back in my apartment, I was still by the window. At 10:23 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from Celeste. "He walked out. He said to tell you, never speak to me through machines." I stared at it for a long time. Then I folded the message into my heart like a letter. And I smiled. Because now, finally, the silence was louder than any voice in that boardroom. I hadn't planned to walk back through those doors. Not after what they'd done. Not after they looked me in the face, measured my worth in degrees I didn't have, and dismissed 19 years of service with a sentence. But I wasn't coming back for them. I was coming back for him. When I stepped into the lobby of Caldas and Moreau that Monday morning, I wasn't a former employee. I wasn't a dismissed relic. I was the person they forgot they needed. The front desk receptionist did a double take when she saw me. "Ms. Rivers? Do you have a visitor badge?" I didn't answer. I didn't slow down. I pressed the elevator button, and it opened like it remembered me. The ride to the 23rd floor felt both longer and shorter than I remembered, like time was stretching to prepare for something inevitable. When the door slid open, I heard it before I saw it. The static hum of awkward silence. The meeting had already collapsed. The Delacroix team had risen from their seats. Thomas stood near the wall of glass, staring out at the city like it had insulted him personally. Celeste was by his side, her arms folded tightly, her face unreadable. Around the table, executives looked lost. Some were whispering frantically into phones. Others tapped furiously at tablets. Marcus stood near the head of the table, pale, sweating, flipping through pages like the answer might be hiding between the margins. But the answer was already in the room. I walked in. No badge, no authorization, no title. Just me, and the hands that had once held this company together. The second Celeste saw me, her posture shifted, rigid to still, then relaxed. She stepped back and said nothing. Thomas turned at the subtle shift in energy, and when he saw me, something in his expression cracked. Just slightly. Not relief, but recognition. I didn't wait. I raised my hands and signed. "I'm here now." He didn't ask why. He didn't ask where I'd been. He just nodded once. Then we began. The room froze as I moved to the center of the table, lifted the contract draft, and flipped directly to Section 4. Terms of expansion and product integration. I didn't need to scan it. I'd written half of it. My fingers moved swiftly, fluidly, translating his questions, contextualizing the clauses, smoothing rough language. He signed, I responded. He paused, I clarified. And with each exchange, the tension in the room shifted, from panic to stunned silence. Marcus stood still, lips parted, speechless. It was like watching someone realize the oxygen they'd been breathing was borrowed. 20 minutes passed in complete command. Not a stutter, not a misstep. Then Thomas set down the pen. The contract was signed. But before the ink dried, he looked up, his gaze locking on Marcus. And then he signed something I'd only seen him use once before. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately, like punctuation marks, each gesture final. Celeste, standing behind him, translated without emotion. This is my last meeting with your management. No one spoke, no one dared. The weight of that sentence hit harder than any lawsuit ever could. Thomas wasn't just ending a meeting, he was ending an era. He turned to me and signed, "You are the only reason I signed today, and you will not be here next time." I nodded once. He touched his chest, "Thank you," then turned and walked out. Celeste followed without a glance back, and the silence they left behind was different now. Not awkward, not nervous, but grave, like the aftermath of something irreversible. Marcus stood still for several seconds, then reached for a chair and sat, slowly. Around the table, the executives looked at me like they were seeing me for the first time, and realizing what had just walked out the door. I didn't stay. I didn't need to. I turned and left the room with the same quiet I came in with. By the time I reached the street, I felt lighter, not because I'd returned, but because I hadn't needed their permission to remind them who I was. That afternoon, the letter came, delivered via legal courier, crisp envelope, Caldus letterhead. I didn't have to open it to know what it said, but I did. To the Executive Committee of Caldus and Moreau, following the personnel changes implemented within your organization and the resulting breach of communication continuity, Delacroix Systems is formally terminating all ongoing partnerships effective immediately. This decision is final. Thomas Delacroix, CEO. At the bottom, below the signature, was a single line handwritten in ink. Pas de machine. No machines. A message for me. Not for them. When the dust settled, when the echo of Thomas's departure stopped reverberating through the 23rd floor, Marcus Bell was left standing in a room full of suits who no longer looked at him like a visionary. They looked at him like a liability, and he knew it. The silence that followed the Delacroix fallout was not relief. It was the hush before the fall. By the next morning, the story had reached the board. By noon, press inquiries were trickling in, and by the end of the week, half of our foreign partners had paused communications, pending internal review. The golden boy from Harvard had cracked the foundation with his own polished shoe. But rather than admit it, he did what cornered men always do. He searched for a scapegoat, and he didn't have to look far. I had walked into his boardroom, said nothing unnecessary, and left with Thomas Delacroix behind me. That moment, the silence of it, the control of it, had humiliated him more deeply than any shouting match could. Because it was witnessed, not just by his peers, but by subordinates. It was recorded in glances, in stunned stillness. Everyone had seen him fail, and I had made it obvious without even speaking. He couldn't undo that, but he could try to erase me. It started small. I got a call from Dana in HR, an old friend. Her voice was tight, careful. "Hey, Susan, just wanted to check something weird. Your employee file, it's been edited. Says your departure was involuntary. That you violated Code 2.8, breach of ethical communication standards. That wasn't there last week." I didn't respond right away, because I knew what Marcus was doing. He was rewriting the story, bit by bit, pixel by pixel. And he was starting where most people wouldn't look, inside the system. The next change came 2 days later. A recruiter I'd worked with 5 years ago messaged me, hesitantly, "Susan, off the record. A contact flagged your name. Said there's concern about your professionalism, behavioral stuff, non-compliance. Someone high up is telling firms to stay away." And just like that, the poison began to spread. Marcus was clever. He didn't come at me with a sword. He came with a scalpel. He inserted subtle lies into company records. He fed recruiters phrases like difficult to manage, reluctant to adopt modern platforms, emotional decision-making, things I couldn't prove false, things that sounded just vague enough to be true. He alerted networks. He whispered through HR channels, tech roundtables, alumni groups. He pulled strings I didn't even know he had. And I said nothing, because anything I said would sound like retaliation. And that's what he wanted. He wanted me to lose my calm, to lash out, to look unstable. But I'd spent nearly 2 decades being underestimated. I'd learned the power of patience. The truth was, I didn't need to defend myself, because Thomas had already done that, with a signature and a sentence. Because Celeste had done that, with her silence. Because the boardroom had watched the collapse happen in real time. They knew who had saved the moment, and who had lost the future. But Marcus couldn't sit with that, so he doubled down. He called an emergency executive meeting behind closed doors, tried to pin the loss of Delacroix on structural miscommunication, on legacy procedures, on undocumented dependencies. He never used my name, of course, but everyone in the room knew what he meant. Meanwhile, my name disappeared from every team list. My notes were wiped from project drives. Meeting logs no longer showed me as an attendee, though I had been present for years of negotiations. They tried to delete me. Digitally, structurally, reputationally. It was surgical. But even Marcus didn't understand what lives outside systems, what lives in people. Because while he was busy editing files and calling in favors to block my prospects, something else was happening that he couldn't see. People were talking, not the ones he controlled, but the ones who remembered. People like Ian, who quietly updated my LinkedIn endorsements. People like Professor Lanning, who made 3 very specific calls to very old friends on industry boards. People like Celeste, who I was certain hadn't just let me into that room out of kindness, but out of strategy. I didn't fight Marcus. I didn't confront him. I let him pull every string he could reach, because I knew something he didn't. I wasn't trapped in the system. I'd outgrown it. He could mark my name with warnings and flags and falsified failures, but he couldn't rewrite what I had built with my hands. And when his lies eventually reached the wrong ears that knew better, they wouldn't destroy me. They would destroy him. Marcus Bell didn't like being ignored. He thrived on attention, on reverent nods in meetings, on inboxes that flooded with approval after each company-wide announcement. He surrounded himself with people who nodded when he spoke and echoed his words back to him as if they were original thoughts. But after Thomas Delacroix walked out of that boardroom, everything changed. The calls stopped coming. The messages from the board grew colder, more direct. Investors who once touted his arrival now asked for clarity and urgent review of strategic missteps. The Delacroix termination wasn't just a lost deal, it was a fracture in his image. And Marcus couldn't stand a crack in his mirror. He needed someone to blame. And I, apparently, had not been punished enough. He thought he was being subtle. He wasn't. He thought whisper campaigns and shadow bans were clever. They weren't. What he didn't understand, what he never understood, was that some people are rooted in more than just a company directory. Some people are known, some people are remembered, and you can't delete someone who lives in memory. On a Tuesday morning, just over 2 weeks after the meeting, Marcus received a letter. It wasn't an email or a note passed through lawyers. It was hand-delivered by courier, signed for by his assistant, and placed gently on his desk before his first coffee. It bore the seal of Delacroix Systems in thick, raised ink. He opened it with the air of someone used to signing off on partnerships, not receiving warnings. Inside, Just one paragraph. No fluff, no ambiguity. To Mr. Marcus Bell, we are fully aware of your retaliatory efforts against Ms. Susan Rivers, including internal record manipulation, defamation of character, and deliberate sabotage of her professional reputation. One more move, and we will see you in court. Delacroix Systems Legal Division. No sign-off, no warmth, just authority, the kind that speaks once. Marcus's hands trembled slightly. He folded the letter twice, too tightly, and placed it in his drawer. But his face, when he looked up into the reflection of the office's glass wall, wasn't angry. It was afraid. Because now he wasn't just managing a reputation. He was being watched. Across the city, I sat at my kitchen table in the same sweater I'd worn the day I walked out. Not because I hadn't moved on, but because it reminded me who I was before the titles, before the recognition. Just Susan, the girl who listened to silence and answered with her hands. My inbox pinged. The subject line was simple. Director position, Aurelia Dynamics. I opened it, half expecting it to be a networking reach-out or an invitation to speak at a small event. Instead, what I read stopped me cold. Dear Ms. Rivers, we've followed your work quietly for years. What you did for the Caldas-Delacroix partnership wasn't just impressive, it was transformative. Your recent experience confirmed what we already believed. You were never just a translator. You were the strategy. We are building something at Aurelia Dynamics. Something new, something global. And we need someone who understands communication beyond language. We would like to offer you the position of Director of Cultural Inclusion. You will be responsible for designing and leading our global approach to communication equity, inclusion strategy, and cultural fluency across all partnerships and internal structures. In short, you will not just interpret, you will lead. We hope you'll say yes. With admiration and respect, Nadira Al-Fayed, CEO, Aurelia Dynamics. I sat with it, for a long time. I thought of all the rooms I'd been in where no one saw me, all the decisions I translated but never got to make, all the deals that happened because I was there, but I was never mentioned in the wrap-up emails, never tagged in the announcements. And now someone was asking me to shape those very rooms, to build something bigger than myself, not with silence, but with voice. I typed slowly. Ms. Al-Fayed, thank you, I accept. With gratitude and with purpose. Let's build something better. Susan Rivers, when I hit send, I sat back and felt something I hadn't in a long time. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just peace. The kind that comes when the truth finally has space to breathe. The kind that Marcus would never understand. Because while he was trying to destroy me in silence, I was rising, louder than ever. No press conference, no exposé, no dramatic interview under a spotlight. I didn't even tweet. Still, the tremors began. It started quietly, the way all deep cracks do, barely visible on the surface, but lethal beneath. A mid-sized client from Singapore terminated a long-standing contract with Caldas and Moreau. No drama. Just a dry, bullet-point email from their legal team citing an unfortunate shift in operational values. It was shrugged off as coincidence, until the next client walked away. Then another, then 5 more in 2 weeks. One of them used a single line in their termination memo. We value people over process. Inside Caldas, the walls were shaking. Outside, I was still silent. By then, I had already moved into my new office at Aurelia Dynamics. It was nothing grand, simple, sunlit, with a round table instead of a desk, and walls painted in soft greens and blues that calmed the noise from the outside world. It didn't look like power, but power was growing there. Real power, the kind that listens before it speaks. I spent my days building, designing training programs for multinational teams, creating structures to protect communication equity, drafting internal protocols that made sure no one could ever be erased the way I had been. I worked with people across continents who had never been heard in their own companies, and for the first time, I wasn't alone. I was leading. Meanwhile, back at Caldas, the damage was no longer manageable. By the 3rd week, The board had ordered a formal internal audit. Investors were getting nervous. The legal team began to sniff around HR, and when they pulled up my file, what they found triggered a flood. The system logs revealed unauthorized edits made to my personnel record after my departure. Fields marked employee performance risk, fabricated timestamps, entries with metadata from a single login, Marcus Bell. They traced the deletion of my project contributions. My name removed from proposal logs, meeting attendance scrubbed, internal messages flagged with vague accusations of insubordination, all mysteriously circulated only after I'd saved the Delacroix deal. The audit team called it strategic tampering. The board called it grounds for liability exposure. Marcus? He called it an unfortunate miscommunication. No one believed him anymore. What sealed his fate wasn't just the forgery. It was the silence. Because while his name sat in bold on the company's masthead, mine sat quietly on the lips of every client he was losing. A New York firm terminated negotiations mid-discussion, citing a loss of ethical trust. A partner in Belgium returned a draft unsigned, stating they no longer aligned with the company's internal priorities. A major international account followed with a single message. "You let go of the one who made us feel heard. We're done." And still, I hadn't spoken publicly. But the board couldn't ignore what wasn't being said. My name became something like a watermark in their losses, barely visible, but suddenly present in every page, every exit, every failed deal. Marcus tried to regain control. He called for emergency strategy meetings. He offered discounts, new account managers, expedited services. He made promises, but the clients weren't listening to promises. They were remembering presence. They were remembering me. One afternoon, I walked into a cafe near Aurelia HQ and ran into someone I hadn't seen in years. Liam Park, a former Caldus team lead who had always treated me kindly but never looked too closely at how things worked. He greeted me with the usual pleasantries, but his smile faded as he stirred his coffee. "They're falling apart without you?" he said, voice low. I gave a small shrug. "They made their choices." He studied me for a moment. "You didn't say a word." I looked him in the eyes. "I didn't have to." He nodded slowly. "That's what scared them the most." Marcus's final downfall wasn't loud. It came in the form of a second letter from an external legal review team, commissioned quietly by the board. The findings were damning: falsified records, ethical breaches, abuse of authority, attempts to damage the professional future of a former employee without justification. He wasn't escorted out of the building, not immediately, but his access was limited. His calendar cleared. His name stopped appearing on internal memos. Within a month, he was transitioned out, as the press release politely put it. But everyone knew. And I still hadn't said a word. Because sometimes truth doesn't shout. It simply endures. And when the noise fades, what remains is presence. There was no dramatic fall from grace. No televised scandal. No paparazzi outside the building. Just a closed-door meeting on a Tuesday morning that would quietly end the era of Marcus Bell. The email had been sent under a confidentiality flag to a select group: senior board members, legal counsel, and Marcus himself. The subject line was stark and stripped of any corporate varnish. Executive session, 10:00 a.m., mandatory. Inside the boardroom, everything had already been prepared. A binder waited at Marcus's seat, thick, heavy, filled with the findings of the internal audit, cross-referenced with legal risk assessments, testimony from HR, IT logs, and a growing list of client withdrawals. At exactly 10 twice, Marcus entered the room. He wore his usual navy suit, tie slightly off-center. He offered his trademark half-smile, charming, tired, a little smug. It didn't land. No one smiled back. The chair of the board, Catherine Dubois, didn't waste time. She opened the meeting with a clipped tone. "You've read the reports?" Marcus cleared his throat. "I have. Some concerns about the conclusions drawn." "Let's be clear," she said. "We're not here to debate conclusions. We're here to discuss consequences. He froze, the way people do when they realize they've run out of script. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were 2 forms, each neatly labeled. One was a resignation agreement, no severance, no post-employment bonus, just a quiet exit and the hope of discretion. The second was a termination notice with cause, pending civil litigation. Catherine's voice was low but firm. You can leave cleanly, or publicly. Marcus's eyes flicked to the others around the table, faces he used to command. They no longer looked at him with expectation, just exhaustion. At 10:23 a.m., he picked up the pen and signed the resignation. By 10:24, the Marcus Bell era was over. He stood, buttoned his jacket like it still meant something, and left the room without a word. No applause, no farewell, only the sound of the door clicking shut behind him. The same week, I got the email. It came from Marcia Keene, a name I hadn't heard in years but remembered well. She'd once been the junior HR coordinator who slipped me an extra break voucher during a brutal week of double shifts and translation emergencies. Now she was interim HR director, and she was writing to me. Susan, we owe you more than we could ever put in words, but perhaps we can begin by learning to do better. We're relaunching our internal education program with a new direction. We want to talk about human value, not just productivity, and we want to invite you back, not as an employee, but as a teacher. Will you return? To teach us what we missed? I read the message 3 times, then sat with it for hours. This place had once discarded me like a file left too long in the wrong folder, and now it wanted me back, as an authority. Not a translator, not a placeholder, a teacher. I replied, yes, I'll see you soon. They called it a leadership and human value session, but people knew what it really was. A reckoning. They booked the largest conference room and still couldn't contain the attendance. People lined the walls, some sitting on the floor. Others watched from overflow rooms via live stream. Some faces were old, others new. All of them waiting to hear something different. I didn't wear anything formal, just black slacks, a deep green top, and the necklace my grandmother gave me the day I learned to spell my name and sign. I walked to the front of the room with nothing but a notepad in my hand and no intention of reading from it. I looked at them all. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others looked down. I began. When I was fired from this company, the reason given was that I wasn't qualified. I didn't have a degree. I didn't climb the ladder the right way. But let me ask you something. I paused. If I was so unqualified, why did the most important client walk out the minute I did? Silence. I wasn't fired because I failed. I was fired because I didn't fit a mold, and we need to stop building our definitions of value around molds that weren't made for real people. Heads nodded slowly. Some executives looked down at their notes, like they were finally understanding a language they had ignored for years. Every company has KPIs and benchmarks, but how do you measure trust? How do you calculate the worth of the only person in the room who understands silence? I looked around. You can't, but you can feel it when it's gone. Then, I raised my hands and signed the rest of the message, not because it was necessary, but because it was symbolic, because the people in the room needed to remember what listening looked like. Afterward, there was no applause. There was something quieter. People stayed. They came up in 2s and 3s, not with pleasantries, but with purpose. I didn't see you before. I do now. I'm sorry. Thank you. And that was enough. Because I hadn't returned for revenge. I'd returned to teach, and the room, finally, was ready to learn. I never set out to become a lesson. I didn't have a mission statement or a 5-year plan. I had work. I had instincts. I had a set of hands trained not just in signs, but in empathy. I had presence, quiet, consistent, and invisible to the people who confused volume with value. But after everything fell, after Marcus Bell walked out of that boardroom for the last time, something unexpected happened. The world didn't move on. It turned, people talked. Not just within Caldas and Moreau, where HR launched listening initiatives and legal quietly rewrote the internal definitions of performance misconduct, but outside, beyond our city, beyond our industry. The story was too quiet to be scandalous, but too symbolic to ignore. A woman with no college degree had carried an international partnership on her shoulders. Through fluency, trust, and human connection, she had been fired. And then she had returned, not to beg, not to plead, but to teach. And the clients, the partners, the world, they chose her. It began with a repost, a short clip from my lecture, just 17 seconds, circulated on social media with the caption, "This is what happens when you fire the one person who knows how to listen." Within days, it had been shared by educators, corporate leaders, HR directors. Some added commentary. Why do we still equate degrees with understanding? Others simply wrote, "Watch this," then change something. Newsletters picked it up. Industry blogs wrote long think pieces titled The Susan Rivers Moment and What HR Got Wrong and What We Can Learn. By the end of the month, I was invited to participate in 5 panels, 2 university lectures, and a government task force on inclusive workforce development. I declined most of them, not out of spite, but because I was busy. Busy building something of my own. What started as a side initiative at Aurelia Dynamics soon grew into a dedicated division, the Resonant Framework Initiative. The mission was simple, but revolutionary. Teach organizations to listen before they lead. Redefine what it means to be qualified. Replace outdated metrics with relational intelligence. Center lived experience as a legitimate form of expertise. My team was small at first, but they were giants in their own right. Daniel, a deaf UX designer, who rewrote accessibility guidelines for client-facing platforms. Priya, a linguist who spoke 5 languages, and often said, "The most powerful thing we can offer people is clarity without assumption." And Zara, a neurodivergent systems architect who once told me, "Your silence gave me courage to stop apologizing for how I communicate." Together, we built training programs, cultural equity audits, and inclusive policy frameworks. We worked with small startups and global firms alike. And everywhere we went, we told them the same thing. Communication is not a privilege. It is a shared responsibility. Meanwhile, Marcus Bell's name became a footnote, a lesson. MBA programs began using Caldas and Moreau's Delacroix incident as a case study, not for business strategy, but for ethical leadership. Recruiters stopped returning his calls. Former allies removed endorsements. The same networks he once poisoned turned away from him, not because he failed, but because he had tried to erase someone who spoke the language of value without ever needing to raise her voice. He became a warning. I became the alternative. I still remember the day a young analyst approached me after one of my workshops. She looked nervous. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. "I didn't think someone like me could be this," she said. "Like what?" I asked. "Leading," she whispered. "Being listened to." I smiled and signed my response slowly so she could catch every word. "You were always this. You just needed someone to show you it was allowed." That, in the end, is what this became. Not my story alone, but a permission slip for every person who ever sat in a meeting, knowing they held the answer but weren't asked. A wake-up call to every company that prided itself on credentials while overlooking wisdom. And a call to action for every leader who still thinks silence is emptiness. It's not. It's a language. One that took me years to learn. One that changed everything when it was finally heard. Now, when I stand before a room of executives, I start not with data or graphs, but with silence. The kind of silence that says, listen before you decide. Value before you measure. Understand before you define. And when the silence stretches just long enough to be uncomfortable, then I begin. With hands. With heart. With all the words I've learned to speak in a world that never expected me to matter. Now I do more than matter. I lead. And they listen. Because once you hear the language of worth, Once you really hear it, you can never go back. Susan never craved attention. There were no book tours, no TED Talks, no viral exposés or revenge speeches. She never weaponized her story, not because she couldn't, but because she didn't need to. Her life had already spoken volumes, and now others were learning to listen. After Marcus Bell's resignation, Caldas and Moreau went through a reckoning. It wasn't swift, real change never is. But Susan's story had left a mark too deep to be covered with PR statements or diversity slogans. They didn't invite her back to fix the company. They invited her to help reimagine it. In the months that followed her guest lecture, she was asked to join a newly formed advisory board. This time, not as a formality, but as a cornerstone. The company had begun rethinking what leadership really meant, and they wanted her to shape that new language. She agreed, but only with conditions. "I don't want to be your figurehead," she told them, standing in a room full of people who used to ignore her. "I want to be your start." They listened. For once, they really listened. Beyond Caldas, her influence expanded in ripples. HR departments at Fortune 500 companies cited her story in internal trainings. Business schools reframed their curriculum, introducing a new category of analysis: relational capital, a term coined from Susan's quiet form of value. She was interviewed for articles, yes, but she rarely gave the same answer twice. When asked what companies need to know most, she said that people's stories are not line items, they're systems, and systems break when we stop listening. One university offered her an honorary doctorate. She accepted it, not because she needed the title, but to prove something: that education has many forms, and all of them deserve honor. Susan didn't just build programs, she built pathways. She created a nonprofit arm called the Rivers Institute, dedicated to redefining what communication looks like in professional settings. The mission was simple: give power to the voices that had always been present, just not acknowledged. Her team developed tools for corporations to evaluate contribution beyond credentials. They trained leaders to recognize nonverbal communication as a strength, not a deficiency. They built hiring rubrics that included lived experience as measurable expertise. She didn't just teach inclusion, she practiced it. Her staff included people who had once been excluded for being too soft-spoken, untraditional, or difficult to read. Under Susan's guidance, they became trainers, consultants, department leads. They were never hard to read. They were just never given the time to be understood. In the later years of her career, Susan was offered a university chair in communication ethics. No application required. No interviews. Just a letter that read, "You've taught more without credentials than we have with them. Let us be the ones to learn from you." She didn't take the job. Instead, she asked the university to use the funding to establish scholarships for students who used alternative forms of communication: sign language, Braille, AAC devices. People like she had been, capable but underestimated. The board agreed unanimously. The scholarship was named in her honor: the Susan Rivers Fellowship for Communication Without Barriers. She never stopped working. Not really. Even in her 60s, she could be found in quiet offices and over Zoom calls, guiding young professionals who thought they weren't enough because their resumes didn't look traditional. She told them what she had once needed to hear: "You are not missing something. You are something." Marcus Bell? He never regained a comparable position. His name occasionally surfaced in comment sections, case studies, or behind-the-scenes boardroom jokes. "Don't pull a Marcus," some would say. His legacy wasn't scandal. It was silence, the kind people leave behind when they don't lead with care. And Susan? Susan's name never needed to be on a building. It was in people. In every organization that started valuing presence over prestige. In every meeting where someone paused to make sure everyone was heard. In every leader who stopped, waited, and listened harder. The lesson of Susan Rivers is not one of revenge. It's resilience. It's the reminder that qualifications without empathy are hollow. that experience can be as powerful as education, and that the quietest people in the room often hold the loudest truths. Her life didn't end with applause or awards, though both came. It ended in the ripple of change she started and never tried to own. She lived not to be seen, but to make others visible. And in doing so, she gave silence a voice. One the world will never unhear.